Thanks for joining today's session. This video, sound for video session, it's the 10th of May, 2016. And today the topic for our session was, or is, what's tripping you up when it comes to recording great audio? And we had some really, really good questions that were submitted over on the Google Plus site. So I'll be referring to those, and we're gonna take a shot at some of those here today. All right, let's go ahead and jump straight into it today. So our first set of questions were from Kevin Steinman. And Kevin, thanks for your questions. The first one was getting the boomed mic in close enough in wider shots so as to prevent echo in the recording, which is tough to deal with in post. I'm thinking of going the lav route, but the sound is not as great as a well-placed shotgun hypercardioid, NTG3 is what I use, into a Zoom H5. All right, Kevin, that's a good first question. It depends. I think it depends partly on how you're doing wide shots. One of the things that I've learned over time is that typically for a narrative piece, you do a wide shot and you also do double coverage of that wide shot. You also get a close shot of the same exact thing. And in that case, when the person reads their lines twice, presumably the exact same lines in both cases, both the close shot and the wide shot, you can easily cut between them using the audio from the close shot. And that, I think, is one of the more effective techniques for doing that, because in editing, you're typically not going to stay on the wide shot for a long period of time once the dialogue starts. Usually that's sort of a more establishing type shot, and then you'll cut to the close shot when the dialogue continues. So if that's possible in your particular case, I don't know what you're shooting exactly, but if that's possible, that's one thing you can do that works quite nicely. Looks like our audio is a little on the hot side here. Hard to tell. These, by the way, these meters, these peak meters, and I say peak meters on Google Plus, aren't very good. So hopefully we're doing okay in terms of audio levels here. All right. Hope that was helpful for you, Kevin. So again, what the main idea there is that to go ahead and shoot a wide shot, shoot a close shot, and you're going to use the audio from the close shot in most cases. We also did have a piece over on my YouTube channel. If you do need to do a wide shot where someone's talking, you can, if it's going to be a static camera, that is to say the camera's locked off and it's not moving during that particular shot, you can composite the microphone out. So you can actually, there have been some shows where they do that. Recently, I believe House of Cards has done that on a number of occasions. And so that's another thing you can do. If you want to see that, just head on over to my YouTube channel. And we did it this year. It was probably back in early March or February timeframe. So that's another technique you can use as well. Second question that Kevin left was how to deal with echo in post without purchasing plugins. Well, honestly, Kevin, I don't know of a way to deal with echo or reverb in post without purchasing a plugin. There are some post-processing engineers that are far more skilled than I am that use sidechain compressors to reduce echo to some extent. And so perhaps at some point we'll experiment with that and have an episode on how to do that. But that's a fairly complex thing. And if that can work okay in cases where the talent's not moving around a lot or turning their head while they speak a lot, so that the phase relationships of the reverb don't change a lot within the scene. But if they start changing, it gets really complicated even to do that. So I think you're probably referring to the fact that we did have a piece over on YouTube sometime last year where we covered a couple of de-reverb type plugins or de-echoing type plugins. I think one was $100 and the other one was, I think, closer to the $50 range, as I recall. So yeah, there's definitely a cost to those. And then of course there's the high-end stuff. There's Isotope RX, which has some de-reverb as well. But all of those do definitely cost money. So I will endeavor to figure out how to do that with a sidechain compressor and EQ. But it's a lot more complicated to do it that way. All right, and then your final question was clipping. Wish I could afford that brilliant Zaxcom system, but what to do with the H5 is the question. So yes, in cases where you're using a recorder that doesn't have a proper analog limiter, like a Sound Devices, or on the Zaxcom end, they actually have a never clip feature, which is a little bit different. If you don't have those, you can still make great recordings. And for years and years and years, I've used these inexpensive Tascam recorders. Tascam's DR60D, Zoom H5 is another example, Zoom H6, Tascam DR70D, 701D. All of those, none of those have proper analog recorders, but you can still make great recordings. And really, I think the secret there is that you have to manage your gain staging up front. So that is to say, sorry, I need to move that screen down a little bit. You need to set your gain stage so that you have enough headroom. Now, it's going to be really tricky if you're doing, say, a horror piece or something where you move between whispering and screaming in the same line. That's going to be tough, and you're just going to have someone on a mixer managing the trim or the fader. But I think really, if you set your gain so that it peaks at minus 12 dB, or you could even go more conservative than that, you could say even minus 18 dB is where you're peaking, where the hottest peaks come in there when the talent is normally speaking. Almost always I've found for at least regular dialogue, even if there is some dynamics in that dialogue, that's almost always enough headroom in my experience. Now, you can also use those limiters that are built in to the Zoom recorder. It's going to be after the analog to digital converter, but it still can proffer a little bit of headroom potentially if you're doing a 24-bit recording. And what I think is happening in that case is that if you are doing a 24-bit recording, what that means is that I think the analog preamp can still capture, yeah, I don't know if this reasoning holds up or not, but in any case, you can potentially turn on those limiters in a Zoom H5 and see if that helps as well. It seems like it can capture some of that, some of those transients, some of those peaks that come up and come back down very quickly as well. Now, if all of that fails, there is a declipping plugin in Adobe Audition, and a lot of other software has it as well. I know that Isotope has it. But that actually works pretty well if you're dealing with relatively mild clipping. That is to say, clipping that has occurred just on the transients and hasn't gotten so bad that it's cut really into the dialogue a whole lot. But if it's just the transients, a lot of times those declipping plugins can actually work pretty nicely. So those are something to consider as well. All right, I hope those were helpful for you, Kevin. Thanks for those questions. I really appreciate it. Those are really helpful, I think, and worthwhile. All right, next one up is from Patrick Albanese. I hope I said that right, Patrick. Trying to find a way to get that slight ambient sound in recording. Sometimes I get too much echo or room noise, and other times it comes out almost too crisp. There's a sweet balance that sounds real, for lack of a better term, and you always have that balance. How the heck do you do it? Well, I think I know what you're saying, Patrick, there, and I think incidentally, if I can also say this, that you're asking that question, I think represents a lot of sort of maturity in terms of your audio skills. That's one thing is I think a lot of times when we first start out, including myself, is I was trying to go for this extraordinarily dry sound. By dry, I mean almost sounds like it was being recorded in the perfect audio soundstage or studio or whatever. And that's not always the number one goal. Sometimes you do want it to sound a little bit more natural, and you want it to sound you want a little bit of the room sound in there. So there are a couple of things that I can tell you. I have to confess, Patrick, I don't necessarily go out with that goal. I think the reality is that when you place your mic appropriately for the framing of the shot, that almost always you're going to get a little bit of room ambiance. Unless the exception is, well, even then, I was going to say with lavaliers, sometimes it can start sounding a little too dry, but even then you usually get a little bit of room ambiance. But I would say, first of all, I almost always, and I think a lot of you have heard me say this before, I almost always go with a boom mic as a first choice. And I usually use lavaliers as sort of a backup option just in case things go badly. So in as much as you can stick with a boom mic, I think you're going to have a better time of that. And every room is going to be a little bit different. Actually, I posted a video this last weekend that was awful in terms of sound once I got it out, but I ran out of time and I had what I had to work with, and so that's what went up. But I was using a lavalier in an extraordinarily echoey room in my house, and that ended up going out the door without any processing. I didn't want to apply processing because it was a little demonstration of that particular microphone, that lavalier microphone. I guess the main thing is, so you need to do, what I would recommend is that before you start recording, if it's a room you haven't recorded in before, definitely spend some time walking around, clapping your hands, and talking within that space to get a sense for how much reverb there is in that room up front. So you have a very clear picture of that. If you know you're getting lots of that, then you're probably going to want to work in with a boom mic a bit closer so that you can get more signal to noise ratio. You can get more dialogue and less of the reverb. So that's one thing to consider. In those cases, I would avoid using a shotgun microphone if you can, if you're indoors. Shotgun microphones have a tendency to, through that interference tube or that phase cancellation tube, they have a tendency to do funny things with reverb. So they're not generally the best choice for extraordinarily reverby rooms. So that's one thing. If you can instead go with a small diaphragm condenser, that is an ideal choice. And there are some really good small diaphragm condensers out on the market that aren't horribly expensive. The Samson CO2, which we reviewed a few months back, does surprisingly well, and it costs $100 for 2 of them. So that one's definitely worth a look if you don't already have one of those. So that's one thing. If you are in a situation where the room is, or the sound is coming out too crisp, I think is the term you used, I would say too dry. And by that, I mean, it sounds exactly like a studio, a perfect studio where there's no reverb at all. In those cases, I would back the microphone off a little bit, give your talent a little bit more room so that you can pick up a little bit of room ambiance. Or one other thing that's important to do as well, and if you're not really sure and you can't necessarily tell from the headphones that you're monitoring, one other thing you can consider doing as well, and which I think is a good practice, is gathering room tone as well. So once you're done with the take, try and get 30 seconds of room tone just by having your microphone, capture the sound of the room. Ideally, you'll leave your talent where they are and have everyone else on set be quiet and go ahead and record some room tone. And you can actually then cut that in the final piece. So that can help in some cases too. I do definitely do that if I'm helping out with if I'm working on a narrative piece, especially when you have the cases where you're doing two different people, like in an interview type situation, and you're cutting between 2 different cameras. Getting room tone in that case is especially important because the tone behind the dialogue for each of the different mics tends to be pretty different. Or even if it's not 2 different mics, it's someone hand booming, just the direction that the microphone is pointed will emphasize different parts of the room. So having that room tone can help sort of even things out as well. And cutting that in can be really, really helpful. All right. So Patrick, good question. So I will be honest, so when I'm doing those narrative pieces, I will capture room tone, and that helps in those cases. In a lot of the other cases, it's just managing the room. So other things that I didn't mention, and perhaps obvious things, but if you're going to be, even if you're going on location and you're working in a room you don't know about, have some sound blankets. That's a very worthwhile investment. If you can't afford sound blankets, just get some old, blankets, ideally with fabric that's somewhat breathable. You don't want a synthetic that's really tightly woven. You want something that's open so it can actually absorb some of that sound, and especially the higher frequency reflective sound that you'll get, the echo and the reverb in rooms. If you can't hang it up, outside of the frame of the camera, at least throwing it on the floor if you're working on a hard floor, that can help a ton. And hanging it up isn't too difficult. You just need, even if someone just holds it up in the air during the take, if you've got someone around on set that can help with that, hanging it up is ideal because then you free up your hands to do other stuff, or in some cases you have to be doing other stuff, operating camera, operating sound, whatever. But those are some things that can really make a difference. And the blankets, I don't want to underestimate how much of a difference that can make. It can be enormous. And it's always good to have a few of those on hand when you're going to do a project or a job. So hopefully those were helpful for you, Patrick. Thanks again for those questions as well. All right, let's see what we've got next here. Next question is from Bingamoon. And the question is how to make sure what we are hearing coming from the microphone and heard through the headphones, boom or otherwise, are matching that of what is being recorded on the external recorder of camera audio in. Okay, let me see if I can make sure I understand what you're asking there. I think a couple things. First of all, I'm not entirely sure if you're asking, how do I make sure in some cases, especially on the lower end recorders, when you're monitoring, first of all, let's talk about monitoring. When you are monitoring, ideally, you really need a decent set. It doesn't have to be horribly expensive, but you need a decent set of headphones. Earbuds just aren't going to cut it, and I would stay away from earbuds because you need some isolation as well, so you can really hear what's going on or what's coming out of the headphone amp on your recorder or mixer or camera. So, first of all, I would also recommend over-ear headphones. So these actually are just on-ear headphones, but over-ear are the bigger cups. They fit over your entire ear, and they need to be closed back. And that's actually what most headphones are, closed back. You don't want open back, which are sort of your audiophile and reference headphones. That's for mixing and pleasure listening. But closed back. So again, kind of the industry standard is the Sony MDR 7506s, I think it's called. They're under $100, but they're close to $100 somewhere, as I recall. Those are kind of the standard. A lot of audio mixers use those, and they're pretty good at helping you identify those types of things. So that's the first thing. You need to have a good set of headphones. Now, where you plug those headphones in makes a difference as well. So if you are actually feeding audio from a mixer or a recorder into a camera, you actually want to monitor, at least in some cases, the audio that the camera's catching, especially if that's going to end up being your production audio. And that is the audio that you end up using in the end for your piece. So if that's the case, then you want to be monitoring what the camera is hearing. So there are a lot of considerations with that. First of all, one of the things you need to do is you need to get tone before you start the shoot. And by that, what I mean is you need to generate a tone from the recorder or mixer. And actually the DR60D Mark II from Tascam has that capability. The Zoom F8 I know has that capability. I'm not sure on the the H5 and the H6. Not really sure on those. Those aren't necessarily made to feed to a camera anyway, though, so probably not the best choices for that type of workflow. But anyway, you can generate a tone, and you can set the level at which that tone is set to on the recorder, and you need to make sure that you have the input gain on the camera set so that that tone is coming across at the same dB level. So you're going to have to watch your meters, and normally the tone is sent at, I believe, minus 20 dB. So you send it at minus 20 dB on your recorder. You need to adjust the gain setting or the output volume on the Tascam recorder so that that tone is also showing on the camera's meter, audio meter, at minus 20 dB. So that's one thing you want to do, is make sure you're getting consistency across those two. Then there are a couple ways you can do it. You can monitor straight from the camera if the camera has a headphone output. Or you can actually send audio from the camera in some cases, and these are more professional setups usually. You'll actually send audio from the camera back to the mixer. And there's a camera return on some mixers. And in fact, the Tascam DR60D Mark II has that as well. So then you could monitor what the camera is hearing from the Tascam. I hope that makes sense. But so the way you would have things hooked up is you'd have the Tascam with your microphones hooked up to that. You'd have a line out to the camera and then another line from the camera back to the Tascam into the camera return jack. And then you could monitor the audio from there. So those are your kind of the main options there. So that's the main thing I would look at in terms of being able to make sure that you're getting what you need to. Now, the big challenge is that on less expensive mixers and recorders, one of the things that you commonly see is that those manufacturers will skimp or kind of cut costs on the headphone amplifier in those devices. And the Tascam DR60D is a great example of that. It's not a very good headphone amplifier. Even the Zoom F8 has a headphone amplifier that's kind of mediocre. It doesn't sound that great. And sometimes you're kind of scratching your head wondering, is that hiss that I'm hearing just in the headphones, or is that also coming in through the microphones and is going to be recorded to the final audio? And in those cases, unfortunately, I think the best solution there is you just have to get to know your mixer really, really well. You have to do some testing with it so that you know exactly how much of that hiss is coming from the headphone amp versus actually coming in your microphones and is a problem that you need to solve. Maybe there's something, maybe the cable is running, is picking up some interference of some sort, or maybe there's a loose connection or something like that. And the way you do that testing up front is you really need to go do some tests where you get your microphone into a room where you know what's going on acoustically, relatively quiet room, I would say, and you maybe record some dialogue and maybe some silent sections between the dialogue, and see how much hiss it's picking up, and check that relative to what you heard in the headphones on that mixer when you did the recording. And you can actually listen to it back on the actual recorder or mixer itself. You can play back the file after it's been recorded, and then you can also download it to your computer, where hopefully you have either some monitors or some headphones where you know exactly how much hiss there is. It's produced in that one as well, that system for playback as well. So I hope that makes sense. You just really have to get to know them. If it is a lower quality headphone amplifier, you just have to get to know how much hiss it's actually introducing, and then you're in better shape once you do get into a situation or a project where you're actually recording. You know whether that hiss is something that you need to fix while you're there in production, or if it's just a feature, I guess I should say a feature of the headphone amplifier of your mixer. So hopefully I didn't beat that question to death. All right, so we have one more question I just wanted to cover here really quickly. Another one from Bingamoon. Actually, this is several questions in one. Let me go ahead and take these one at a time. Long shotgun or short for dialogue scenes? That's the first question. Well, if you're shooting outdoors, then I think it depends on how far away from the source you are, how far away from the talent you are. In most cases, I find a short shotgun microphone to be probably the most commonly used. It's a lot rarer to use a long shotgun, although there are cases where you need to do it. And if you have the budget to afford a long shotgun microphone, they're not generally inexpensive. They're generally a little bit more on the expensive side. So for example, the Rode makes the NTG2, which is about a $270 short shotgun microphone. They make the NTG3, which I believe is a $700. It's either $600 or $700-ish shotgun microphone. And then they also make the NTG8, which is a long shotgun microphone, and I believe that one is about $1,000. So a long shotgun is always going to cost you more. It's also going to be more difficult or more expensive, I should say, not difficult, but actually maybe even more difficult as well, but it's more expensive certainly to get wind protection for a long shotgun microphone. By wind protection, I mean, excuse me, either the furry covers or the blimp covers if you're really going to do it properly. So it's going to be more expensive. So there's a fair bit of expense involved in long shotgun microphones. And my sense is that they're not generally, you don't need them as often. If you are doing a wide shot, again, as I mentioned earlier in the session here today, oftentimes I will just get close coverage as well as wide coverage. And most directors of photography are used to that. So that shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who's an experienced director of photography. And if they're not experienced, you can always just explain to them, hey, would it be possible I need to get a wide shot here. I need to also get some close-up coverage so that I have some audio to work with and that we can cut in the edit, cut into the wide shot. So those are a couple of things there. So yeah, a long shotgun is going to be if you have to hold it back farther. It doesn't actually change the sensitivity of the microphone. All a long shotgun does relative to a short shotgun is it decreases the size of the sweet spot where sound is picked up by that shotgun microphone. So on and actually one thing to keep in mind too is that the pickup pattern of these very directional microphones like shotgun microphones is actually sort of a cone shape in somewhat respects. And the longer the shotgun you use, the smaller the cone. So all it does is it rejects noise around the talent and picks up in a smaller sweet spot. So my answer, I guess my short answer, that was my long answer. I guess my short answer is I don't have a long shotgun microphone, so I don't use them a whole lot. In fact, have I ever used one? Maybe there was once. It wasn't mine. Obviously, I don't own one. Um, and that was where we had, by the nature of what we were shooting, we did have to use a long shotgun. It's rare. So anyway, and actually, here's another consideration too. When you're doing a wider shot, sometimes it's okay to pick up a little more ambiance. And so it's okay to back up that short shotgun microphone a little bit and pick up a little more ambiance. So something to consider. How to make sure the boom mics are not capturing the sounds that are bouncing off the walls and windows for indoor dialogue scenes. Well, that's where I have a pretty strong opinion. I think in most cases, I like to avoid using shotgun microphones indoors. I know there are plenty of mixers that do that, but they're using more sophisticated shotgun mics in most cases. And they're using them generally if there's a room that they're working in with a lot of reverb, they generally won't choose a shotgun microphone. And again, it's because of that interference tube design. The reverb bounces off the walls, moves into the interference tubes, and actually starts to cancel some of the dialogue, but at a strange delay to the actual dialogue, so that you get all sorts of weirdness. So again, that's where I would use a small diaphragm condenser microphone of some sort. You could also use, and actually that's your next question. So condenser or dynamic mics for indoor dialogues, or perhaps even ribbon. Well, so yeah, if I'm indoors and especially if I'm in a very reverberant room, lots of echo, I will typically use a small diaphragm condenser microphone of some sort, typically a supercardioid or a hypercardioid. And in my case, I use an Audio-Technica 4053B for most of my shoots presently, and that works pretty nicely. I do also like cardioids sometimes, just straight cardioids. And I have that Samson CO2 that we reviewed a couple months back, which is technically probably closer to supercardioid. And there are differences between those different pickup patterns. If you're not familiar, the cardioid picks up almost nothing from the back of the microphone. Supercardioid is a little bit tighter on the front, but then starts to have a tail where it does pick up some of the stuff from the back of the microphone, sound that's generating or, is coming from the back of the microphone. And then hypercardioid has an even tighter pickup pattern on the front, but it picks up even more on the back. So it's sort of a trade-off. And I think that what most mixers have sort of settled on is supercardioid seems to be a pretty good kind of compromise between those two. And so a lot of times they'll use supercardioid pickup pattern microphones. So in my case, for indoor dialogue, I will almost always choose a small diaphragm condenser. In my case, again, a hypercardioid Audio-Technica 4053B. Probably the industry standard in TV and film production where there is a budget is the Schoeps CMC 641 or MK41, which is a supercardioid pickup pattern, small diaphragm condenser mic, very much like the Audio-Technica, but a little higher end, more expensive, has a different sound quality to it. There are others as well. Another very, very popular one and one we reviewed late last year was or is the Sennheiser MKH50, which is it's a supercardioid pickup pattern, small diaphragm condenser. It is not a shotgun microphone, used very often on indoor dialogue scenes. And that one, that one has a kind of in terms of the way it sounds, is a little bit different to me. It sounds much more aggressive to me. So it generally, I'm actually thinking of buying one, but I have not sold myself on it entirely yet, because again, it's kind of a special purpose mic, but a lot of people love that sound. And in fact, a lot of TV shows now, they're shooting with Sennheiser MKH50s. So it's a pretty popular one. As for ribbon microphones, that was one thing you asked about as well. I do own a ribbon microphone. Ribbon microphones have a figure 8 pickup pattern, so I don't find them all that useful for filmmaking, unless it's okay for that ribbon microphone to be in the frame, first of all, or if it's not in the frame, you have a very nice room in terms of its acoustic properties, so it doesn't have a lot of echo or reverb. Now, granted, you need to keep in mind, historically, and by historically I mean a long, long time ago, ribbon microphones were kind of, back in the 1920s, were kind of one of the first or the first microphone technologies developed, and they were used in film. And the reason they used them in film was that they have a figure of 8 pickup pattern, which means they pick up sound from the front and equally from the back, but they reject the sound entirely off to the sides. And so what they would do is they would place the microphone right next to the camera, because those cameras back then were very, very noisy. And so that was its best chance of being able to reject all of the camera noise and yet pick up some of the sound from the actors. But again, almost nobody that I know that's doing mixing professionally is using a ribbon microphone normally for dialogue. For voiceovers, maybe, if they're doing it in a, capturing that sound in a studio space or some sort of space that has been acoustically treated, so you're not picking up all that extra ambiance from behind the microphone, or at least not very much. So, all right. So that brings us to the end of our session here and all of the questions that were posted. I wanted to really, really thank all those of you that posted questions. Those are super helpful and I think really interesting. I think they're all very good practical questions about how to improve your sound quality when you're capturing for film and video. Hopefully that was helpful for all the rest of you as well. Go ahead and leave any questions you have down below, either on the Google Plus page or over on the Curtis Judd audio page channel over on YouTube. And we'll talk to you guys again next week. Take care.